Okay. So now the first thing that everybody is concerned about today is what is the health status of the Dalai Lama?
Well, as far as I know, as you know, he celebrated his 88th birthday on July 6th.
Right.
July 6th is his birthday, and His Holiness said he's in very good health given his age. I mean, he has some difficulty with his knees and walking, but mentally he is fit and alert. And, you know, everybody comments how young he feels just because of his spiritual practice and his vitality and, you know, warmth and compassion that he generates. So, and he said that he plans to live for at least another 10 to 12 years. So, I mean, that's what he said.
So that's very interesting, you know, because there was, you know, a huge talk about his, you know, his reincarnation, especially with, you know, the Chinese claiming that they have the heir apparent to the Dalai Lama.
Correct.
Whereas there's also an heir apparent in India. So how does the Dalai Lama himself stand on this in terms of his...
Again, I mean, you know, remember when we talk about reincarnation, that happens only after the person passes away. So you can't identify a reincarnation before the person has passed away. I mean, that itself is a ridiculous notion. And this is why His Holiness has been very, very cautious, because with the Panchen Lama, unfortunately, this incident happened that when the Panchen Lama was born and identified as the Panchen Lama, not only did the Chinese then kidnap him, but then put another person, another young boy, and called him the Panchen Lama. So His Holiness really wants to stay away from these kinds of politics. So that is why at this point he has said he's going to live for at least another 12 years. And then he will also, he has said, you know, a couple of things. He said, one, he will see whether maybe this institution of His Holiness needs to continue or not, whether it would be worthwhile or not. And the second, he's also joked that if he reincarnates, maybe he'll reincarnate as a beautiful woman next life.
Okay.
So, but he's left it out in the open because exactly of this, you know, the Chinese trying to claim, after not believing in Buddhism and in this whole theory of reincarnation, believing that they can identify the Dalai Lama, which is,
But the first thing, I mean, coming to the first aspect wherein he said he is considering whether to continue this, you know, tradition of the Dalai Lamas here on. I mean, why would that be a thought for consideration at all, if I may ask?
Well, because of this political, I mean, if Tibet was autonomous, and by the way, right now, His Holiness is not asking for freedom or separation from China, as far as I understand it, but he is asking for Tibet being an autonomous region within China, so that the Tibetans can preserve their culture, their tradition, their language, and their religion within the context of China. So he's not asking for complete separation or freedom from China, but autonomy within China. But the concern is, given the present leadership and the way their attitude towards Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism, and especially His Holiness, I mean, I think it may be skillful also. He's saying, because if I continue and I pass on, the Chinese have the possibility of creating all kinds of mischief, you know, and claiming all kinds of things. So that is why at this point, that question has come up. Is it worthwhile, given the context that the Chinese are still in control of Tibet?
Okay. On the second aspect in then, you know, when he said the next Dalai Lama may be a female reincarnation, from where did that, you know, thought basis come from? Or was it just light-hearted? I doubt. I mean, I would take him. Or was it just joking?
No, he was half joking, but the idea was, I think, partly also maybe Westerners claiming, why isn't there a female Dalai Lama? Why are all the high lamas male? And so that is, in that context, His Holiness said, maybe I'll come back as a female. Who knows? Yeah.
May I then ask you, this is an interesting aspect. I mean, today we
Right.
talk about gender equality, but just to
Right.
know, I don't have knowledge on this history. But after the Gautama Buddha and his order being what was the prevalence of women monks like yourself? I mean, how dated is that in Buddhist history?
Actually, it was during Gautama Buddha's time, after Gautama Buddha attained enlightenment. Of course, he came back to the palace because he wanted to help his parents. And his mother, of course, had passed away when he was a young boy. And his aunt, his mother's sister, had been appointed the queen, and she was the stepmother, and she brought him up. So in fact, his stepmother, who was called then Mahaprajapati, became the first nun in the Buddhist tradition. And initially, Gautama Buddha was very reluctant to make her a nun, because part of being a nun means being a renunciate, giving up the palatial comforts that she was used to, having to go into the forest. So he was actually very skeptical and concerned about her well-being. And so he initially hesitated. But then his attendant, Ananda, said, let us really reconsider this. And so because of the kindness of Ananda, then the Buddha reconsidered and allowed her to become the first nun. And there were 500 nuns, actually. And the Therigatha actually documents the life stories of these nuns. Okay. So there was a very, very strong nun community during the time of the Buddha. But then what happened? Buddhism went from India directly to Tibet. It was taken by the Nalanda masters. So the Nalanda University is this very famous university in Bihar. You can still see the ruins there. The scholars from there, interestingly enough, took this tradition directly to Tibet. In fact, the kings called them, and they were responsible then for taking the Buddhism in its pure form to Tibet. And what happened was, over the generations, that tradition, the Nalanda tradition, was very carefully preserved and thoroughly preserved by the generations of Tibetans and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And ironically enough, because the Chinese took over Tibet, the world had the good fortune that His Holiness came into exile into India. And not only did Indians then get an opportunity to get back in touch with this very ancient culture, ancient tradition, wisdom tradition, but the rest of the world also got this opportunity, which would not have happened if His Holiness had continued to stay in Tibet. But so of course, it was at the expense of the Tibetans going through this terrible trauma that they had to experience.
So basically, the purest form of Buddhism is in Tibet, because it was not adulterated, since it was, imported from Nalanda, as you said. Whereas in India, if you see today, it's become totally into a...
Right. In fact, in India, it died out. I mean, Buddhism died out, literally. So when, and to just, now to finish that, when the tradition, Buddhism went to Tibet, the lineage, unfortunately, none of the nuns went to Tibet. So the lineage of the nuns was not established in the Tibetan tradition. The nuns that were then later on ordained initially did not have the status of the monks. They were kind of, the term in Tibetan for nuns is ani. And ani means literally auntie. And so they were treated like kind of aunties, not very respectfully. They were not kind of given the education and the training. But since His Holiness has come to India, very slowly and systematically, he has ensured that now the nuns get the same quality of education and training. And so just like the monks, we now have nuns graduating as geshes. Geshes means it's like a PhD degree, the highest degree you can get after 17 to 20 years of studying in a monastic university. So now we have very qualified nuns. But in terms of ordination status, the monks have, the novice vows, which is what we as nuns have. But they also then become fully ordained. So they have the Getsu, which is the novice, and the Gelong, which is the fully ordained monks. But for nuns at this point, we still are only ordained as novice. But because that lineage was broken, we don't at this point have the opportunity to become fully ordained yet. But His Holiness and several scholars are working to try and re-establish that tradition. Okay, it says my internet connection is unstable. I just switch off my video so that.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's
okay.
fine.
So that is the only difference that remains. But now nuns are really full-fledged. They are respected. They are well-educated, and they have become teachers who are also teaching both here in India and in the West.
All right. So now coming to the Dalai Lama, the tradition of the Dalai Lama, can you just give a little bit of a, I think it would be, not everybody's familiarized with the concept of the Dalai Lama apart from what we have seen in our lifetimes, that is the Dalai Lama. So how did the Dalai Lama's tradition begin in Tibet?
That's a good question. I would really encourage you to go to his website. His website is dalailama.com. And there's a full history of the Dalai Lamas, the photos, everything. Okay. So rather than me trying, because that's a good question, I should really look it up too,
Yeah, no, fair enough. I will do that. Yeah. But he's,
yeah,
can you tell me his, his numeric status in terms of being the Dalai Lama, to which order?
He's the 14th Dalai Lama. So there 14. Have been 13. And in fact, this particular Dalai Lama has been the most amazing of all of them in terms of his scholarship, in terms of the extent of activities he's engaged in worldwide, in terms, and it's not just Buddhism His Holiness is promoting. His
that is, I think, his distinction.
Mission. In fact, you will see that on his website. There are 4 commitments that His Holiness has. And his first commitment is, of course, to human well-being, the promotion of human welfare, and then religious harmony, and then also taking aspects of Buddhism that are universal, like as he says, Buddhism is a mind science. So taking the scientific aspects, which have a universal flavor. He has engaged with dialogue with scientists through the mind-life dialogues for over 20 years, physicists, psychologists, educators. And as a result of that, now you have more scientists in the West who are interested in Buddhism. And even now, quantum physicists are in dialogue with His Holiness, and they recognize, in fact, that some of the commonalities between the two disciplines, because both of them are looking at the nature of reality, or what is truth. And so there's been a lot of interesting and fascinating dialogue between those two groups. Sorry,
yeah.
So His Holiness is really one of the most remarkable Dalai Lamas and human beings in terms of his warmth, his compassion, and really promoting the welfare and even the environment, and helping us Indians reawaken to the ancient tradition that
Right.
we had, So he's
Absolutely.
done an amazing amount of activities, including re-establishing Tibetan Buddhism within India. You have the big monasteries in the south, Drepung Losling, Serajay, and Ganden, in the state of Karnataka. And then, of course, there are many monasteries and nunneries even in the Dharamsala region. But he has made sure that the tradition stays pure and authentic. And now there are so many people, including Westerners, who are interested in this tradition.
I get your point. Yeah, because in India, it was, as a journalist, had occasion to be writing about what was going wrong, at the Mahabodhi Society, where there was a Sri Lankan monk, who came and he was literally selling the bones of Buddha. In 1954, the government of India had handed over the bones of Gautama Buddha to the Mahabodhi Society. And he was selling scrapings for millions of pounds sterling and yen to, because they believe, even if there's a small speck of Buddha's bone in a pagoda that they construct, like there are a few here in Mumbai, so that becomes the ideal space for meditation and all that. And therefore, those bone fragments. But of course, I had written about what was going wrong there. And the agencies of the government had also worked very sharply, and that monk had even been booked subsequently, and he was asked to pay up a fine 7 crore. But he said no. Anyway, that's so it's very essential.
In that context, I just want to clarify. So the lineage went once before the Buddhism died out in India. So there was a lineage that went to Tibet. But then there was also the lineage that went to China. And then from China, it went to Southeast Asia, like Japan and Korea. And that version is what's called the Sanskrit tradition. His Holiness doesn't like to use the word Mahayana, but Mahayana, it was the great vehicle, the vehicle that wishes to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. But then there was another tradition that went from India to Sri Lanka, Thailand, Indonesia, which is called the Pali tradition, or what was called previously the Hinayana, or the small vehicle. And His Holiness tries to avoid this small and large because it can have a pejorative connotation. And it's important to understand they are not distinct necessarily or separate traditions, because Mahayana is based on the Hinayana. These are all teachings of the Buddha. But the Mahayana just goes further than the Pali tradition in terms of wanting to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Whereas the Pali tradition that went to Sri Lanka and Thailand and all on, they are focused on personal liberation. They are not interested in Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings. So there are those two traditions, and this is another thing His Holiness has done, because unfortunately, people were misunderstanding these two traditions. His Holiness has encouraged dialogue between the monks and nuns of these different traditions. He has invited, like the Thai monks and several monks, to Dharamsala to have dialogues with them, so that people can see that foundationally, what we are all talking about is the same thing. But then there are additional differences beyond that.
Coming back to, you had mentioned about how the Dalai Lama looks at, being within China and, seeking autonomy rather than separation, as you mentioned. Now, what we are seeing today is there seems to be this aggressive, I wouldn't say exploitation exactly, but like India is holding a global Buddhism conference. China is holding a conference. So it's apparent that China has never been, the government there is not so inclined to Buddhism, but they seem to be trying to create a groundswell of support for themselves, probably by conducting such conferences, because they're very keen that India should not. And likewise, India is doing same, trying to now harness Buddhism. I mean, as I'm into
Yeah,
the politics.
I must say, yeah, I was surprised when Narendra Modi actually came to inaugurate this global Buddhist conference that happened in Delhi recently. And His Holiness was also invited, because clearly it's sending a signal, intentionally or unintentionally, to China that we are going to give Buddhism a place in this country, and that they will be supported. So for me, I mean, I must say, hats off to Modi for doing that. And I also must say the Chinese people, by the way, in fact, there are a lot of Chinese who are now following Tibetan Buddhism. But the government, I don't know. And whether, as you said, the government is now using this for their own political aims. They are trying to manipulate, how they are looking at Buddhism. But clearly the intention of the Chinese government is less than noble in terms of, genuinely wanting to promote religious harmony and well-being and dialogue. His Holiness has always emphasized dialogue is what is most necessary. And His Holiness being, as he says, he's a simple Buddhist monk, non-violence is the core of his philosophy. So there is no way they would retaliate, because as you can see in the rest of the world, when you do that, all you're doing is creating the seeds for future wars. The conflict never ends. In fact, His Holiness says he prays for the Chinese militia and the government every day, because I mean that is the Buddhist view, that you view all sentient beings as your mother beings, and you recognize their potential in spite of their, unfortunately, their cognitive distortions and all the afflictions that come up that don't allow them to see reality for what it is. So he's an amazing leader. I mean, if we had more leaders like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, this world would have been a very, very different place,
Absolutely. But what is his location? For example, I mean, if there is this conference in India and the conference in China, how would he respond to either invitations, if I may put it that way?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, the reality is, if he were to go to Tibet today or visit China, he would be imprisoned. I mean, there's no question about that.
Exactly.
So you see that in that context, it doesn't make sense. It's not that he wouldn't like to participate, but the reality is he would be imprisoned, and then, that would create so much confusion and pain and angst for the rest of the world, especially the Tibetans. Correct. So he's been emphasizing that he wants to have dialogues with the Chinese to resolve this issue with Tibet amicably, so that he can return to Tibet. In fact, if you see the movie Kundun, which talks about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, how his reincarnation was found, one of the things His Holiness said is that he had 3 dreams, I think, and the last one was about returning to Tibet before he passes away to an autonomous region of Tibet. So he's looking forward to that. And if that happens, that would be really amazing and miraculous.
So we are hoping for that to happen in the next 10, 12 years, as you said. I mean, earlier that
I hope so. We hope so. We definitely hope so,
But again, then coming to the reincarnation, like there are, like, obviously India is trying to protect the Dalai Lama against China. India has been openly, supportive of the Tibetan cause in recent years, particularly. Now, even the Americans have jumped in, is what I understand. That the Americans are very keen to, because the Dalai Lama has, very fruitfully engaged in a lot of dialogues in the US of A. And, so that is obviously going to pay dividends in terms of, and so today we are seeing this when there is this global, confrontation that has set about, over a year and a half back, February last year, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And now you're seeing that playing out in more of a, geopolitical status. And the Russians, for example, as I lately learned, are also very keen to, take a stand with China on the Tibetan
I
issue.
see.
So, which is a
I
huge
see. I
thing.
see.
We would never imagine
I
something
see.
like that between such close allies as Russia and China have always been. But the fact that the Russians are also exploring this is certainly a positive bit of information, I would imagine, because
Wait, wait,
this
wait. So what are the, I'm sorry. So what are the Russians exploring?
they are exploring whether they need to take a clear stand with
Oh, I
China
see.
on certain
I
issues,
see.
particularly
I
because they
see.
also have a very close connect with India now.
Yes.
And in
Yes.
the play out
Historically, we have had,
exactly, but
that's
right,
very interesting because
yeah,
in recent years, Buddhism has spread to Russia, and there are a lot more Russians now who are
okay,
interested, and you have more centers, you have more lamas going to Russia, you have more Russians coming to India to really learn about Tibetan Buddhism. So that may have got the attention of the Russian government. And that would be indeed a very positive development if Russia does not ally with the Chinese government with
yes,
respect to the issue of Tibet. That would be amazing. That
it
really
would
would
be.
be amazing.
And because of that, I suspect now the Americans are kind of ratcheting up their whole involvement in the process, so much so,
I see.
like the USA does not want the next Dalai Lama to be in India. I mean,
I
in a
see.
manner of
Where do
speaking,
they want him to be?
well, that's the question that we are all trying to
I see.
understand. That is why I thought
I see.
it would be very one, people don't have a knowledge about what goes around, you know, uh,
Right.
really in real terms and things like that. So like the Russia, US, and EU are also at the same time helping India to protect the Dalai Lama against China. I mean, they have,
Right.
in their own individual manners, been supportive. And
I
because
see.
he is, in India and Dharamsala, therefore, they have to form that so-called coalition on the
I see.
aspect of Dalai Lama and the future of. So when you say, autonomy being what is demanded,
Yes.
is that, politically a feasible thing? If I may just, give you an anecdotal reference. Years ago, when we were under the British rule in
Right.
1907 and 1908, freedom fighters like Gopal Krishna Gokhale were seeking autonomy. Yes, it give us
Right.
semi-autonomy. But there was at the
Right.
same time an Englishman who's known as Deen Bandhu because of the great work he did in India, Charles Freer
Yeah.
Andrews. And he said nothing doing, you need complete freedom. You know,
Mm-mm.
there is no concept of semi-autonomy that's going to work for India.
Right.
So, in that context, how would you look at it?
Well, see, again, I don't know. This is something you should ask somebody who has more political knowledge. And in a way, I don't know whether this is also skillful means that the first step His Holiness is asking from the Chinese is let's at least get autonomy within China. At
Okay.
least let's focus the dialogue so that it may be less heated or maybe it's more feasible at this particular point. And then maybe later something else. But at this particular point, from my understanding, that's what His Holiness is really negotiating for.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. One mistake, one faux pas on my end. I should have begun by asking you, your, how you are placed in the Tibetan Buddhism ecosystem. So
No,
could you please tell me your role as an ambassador? I mean, I only know that your mom had mentioned to me once that she's an ambassador
I
for.
no, I'm not an ambassador. I'm just a simple nun. I mean, the way I got interested in Tibetan Buddhism was because, I mean, ironically enough, growing up in Mumbai, I had never heard of His Holiness. We had studied a little bit about Buddhism in school, but I
Yes.
had always been interested in questions about suffering and healing. And so I thought Western psychology had the answers. So after my master's, I went to the US to do my PhD and did my postdoctoral fellowship. And then I was teaching there at a university, and I heard of this person called His Holiness coming to give teaching. So I thought I'd go and check it out. And I knew when I entered that stadium, it was a huge stadium, and His Holiness was talking on the Heart Sutra, and we had Putan Jinpa as the translator. And in fact, the Lama who became my teacher, Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, introduced His Holiness. And I remember listening to it and thinking, wow, this sounds just like family. So I knew I had stepped into something that was precious. But then it took me several years of going around trying to find teachers. But every year at that point, His Holiness was coming twice a year. And every time His Holiness came, I would listen. And the more I listened, I became convinced this is what I was looking for. So for me, it was a very logical step. Then I realized I could not juggle a full-time career and trying to study Buddhism. And if Buddhism had the answers and Buddhism was the best psychology and Buddha the best psychologist, then there was no point wasting time. I would, as well delve into it. And so then with my teacher's permission, I was doing an online course through Lama Tsongkhapa Institute in Italy at that point. I asked my teacher and he said, yeah, I had also gone to Dharamsala at that particular point, wondering whether I should become a nun. But then when I looked at the Tibetan nuns, I felt this was too different for me to be part of that culture. But then in the West, when our teacher had a retreat, I saw the Western monks and nuns. And when I looked at them, I said, oh, I can definitely become that. So that was when my teacher encouraged me to get ordained with His Holiness. So in 2014, about 9.5 years back, I got my novice ordination from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So since then, I am nobody in the Tibetan Buddhist, how should I say it, world. I'm simply studying and at this particular point and learning, doing my best to learn how to practice, as His Holiness always emphasizes. If you want to call yourself my disciple, you have to learn how to practice. Practice what? Love and compassion, practice living with reality, those kinds of things. And that's where I am. I'm still learning how to practice, So I can't call myself a formal ambassador or a representative, but clearly I'm interested in the Tibetan issue and the Tibetan cause, and certainly praying that His Holiness is able to go back, to Tibet.
And tell me a little bit about His Holiness's interactions with the, like you said, it's the concept is wrong about the reincarnation being identified before, but there is heir apparent in India. There is, so as far as the Indian heir apparent is concerned, have you interacted with this child? What can you tell me about?
I have never heard of an Indian heir apparent to His Holiness.
Okay.
I really, this is the first time I'm hearing that. I can imagine the Chinese coming up with a ridiculous concept like that. But in India, I've never heard about somebody being identified.
Rather than ridicule, the Chinese announced that the next Dalai Lama is already been identified in China. That is how they went about it.
But it doesn't happen that way. What is reincarnation? Reincarnation is simply at the moment of death.
Correct. The idea is, yes.
Yeah, the mind continues. So then the mind finds another suitable body. And of course, His Holiness being enlightened, he can choose how and where he wants to reincarnate. Unlike people like us, because our karma propels us in that direction. So he has not passed away for his mind to take another body. So then how could a reincarnation be identified? I don't know.
My learning is, so that is a non-issue, right? Then thanks for that.
As far as I'm concerned, and maybe it might be worthwhile for you to find somebody from what is it called, CTA in Dharamsala. His Holiness has given up his political responsibilities, but he has made sure that there is a democratic system that has been established within the Tibetan community that has a president and autonomous. So it would be helpful for you to contact somebody from, I
It
don't know
would
what
be
the
there on the
full form
Dalai,
of,
it would be on the website, or could you give me some
it should be,
contact?
or you just, or look at CTA. I forget what the full term of CTA is.
Okay.
In Dharamsala, the Secretariat, Tibetan Secretariat, yeah, Tibetan, yeah, Central Tibetan something, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
and
will look that up.
in fact, that would be the best people to talk to about understanding the political dynamics
Correct.
and the reincarnation issue.
Okay. I
Yeah.
need to, I was hoping to talk some more with you, but I think I've already got, uh, it's showing
Yes,
me.
now I really have to go because I just have less than an hour and I need to spend some more time with Appa and Amma. So please
All
give
right.
my very warm regards to your mom, and hopefully next time we come and Vicky comes, we can all meet.
Yes, that would be wonderful. And let's hope
Okay.
that's soon enough. And you have a great journey ahead also. Yeah. All the best to you,
Yeah.
Julie. And give my
Bye.
regards to Amma and Apacha also.
Okay. Take care. Thank
Right.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.